it has been a terrific run for Apple. And look, credit to them. I think they've executed extremely well during the pandemic. They've really driven the services business, and investors are increasingly recognizing Apple as, an extraordinary consumer brand. Now, that said, as we look forward, we have seen the stock go up 25% since October 1st. The stock's trading at about 33 times forward earnings, which is about as high as Apple has ever traded on a multiple. And we've seen, this will now be the third year where we've had a really strong year-end run. We typically haven't seen that persist, particularly ending 2020 and going into 2021. We had a similar phenomenon. The stock had a really nice run up at the end of the year, went to about 32 times earnings. It underperformed somewhat in the first half. So I don't think there's anything, quote, wrong with the Apple franchise, but the stock's had a tremendous run, particularly in the last 3 months. I'm not so sure that necessarily persists in the first 3 or 6 months of 2022.
One of the things that you've been thinking about for the longer term, though, is the stock buyback program, and that's been pretty phenomenal, buying back such a huge amount of shares with the cash they have on hand. You actually think that they could continue this for a very long time to come? I mean, 15 years?
Yeah, it's really incredible. I mean, Apple is a cash-generating machine, and it pays a modest dividend, and it doesn't do acquisitions, so it generates a lot of cash that can continue to use to buy back shares. And then ultimately, it also has a big cash balance right now, net cash of almost $100 billion. So the combination of those two things, strong free cash flow generation that doesn't have a claim on it, plus a healthy cash balance today, means that Apple can continue to buy back its shares aggressively for the next 5 years. If it chose to take on a modest amount of debt, which its balance sheet could do, it could probably buy back, by our analysis, 2% of its shares, 2 to 3% of its shares per year for 15 more years. And, obviously that's accretive to EPS. So the buyback alone on a sustained basis could add 2 or 3% to EPS growth.
On the other side of the ledger, though, there are concerns about the supply chain for Apple and its tight relationship with China, when the relationship between China and the United States is really fraying at this point. How do you try and do a risk-reward scenario for international relations at this point, which obviously matter?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Becky. And Apple's exposure to China is almost 20% of its revenues, but obviously much more so in terms of its supply chain and its products being almost entirely assembled in China. So there's really significant geopolitical risks, but it's very difficult to handicap that. I think Tim Cook deserves a lot of credit for the diplomacy that he has exhibited in China. And fortunately, Apple, unlike a lot of other companies, because it's such a large employer in China, that somewhat works to its advantage. It's not only benefiting from China, but it is beneficial to China. And so from that perspective, it may have a little less risk, than other companies, which are really only participating and arguably taking from China. But it's very difficult to handicap what might happen geopolitically. I would just say that Apple is arguably in a slightly more, or not even slightly, in a more advantaged position than other companies, given its employment base there.
Hey, Tony, I know that Apple has some pretty talented managers and people who are really putting a lot of input from different areas in the entire company. We used to talk about Steve Jobs as being the key man, as the founder, and that nobody would ever really be willing to take that role. But I would say the job that Tim Cook has done over the last many years makes him the key man at this point. It's kind of phenomenal to think of a founder handing off to somebody else who you then look at as being indispensable. How do you factor for that?
Yeah, look, I think Tim's done a tremendous job, and part of it has been China, which we just spoke about. But I think the other was really transforming Apple into a services company. That, Tim's belief that Apple has a franchise and a trust with consumers, and that it could leverage its installed base to sell services that they would enjoy and would enhance their experience. That's probably been the coup of what Tim Cook has done. Now, I think to some degree, just given Tim's personality, the leadership is a bit more distributed than it was when Steve was CEO. And so I think that's a good thing. And I think Tim is good about inculcating a culture and skills, perhaps more broadly than Steve was, who was very, very product driven and very creative driven. I would argue that Tim is a more well-rounded manager in that sense. But, kudos to him. I do think Apple has a great bench of executives. It's not clear who the heir apparent is. I think Tim's been clear. He's probably not there for a decade, but he's here for a few more years. Yeah. And so there's still time for that to play out.
Shepard Smith here. Thanks for watching CNBC on YouTube.